For weeks, military censors controlled exactly what footage could leave the city. Journalists knew it. Analysts knew it. Even foreign governments tracking the conflict in real time knew that the images reaching the outside world had been filtered, delayed, and in some cases, simply blocked. That was the official architecture of information control during the Iran-Israel war, and for as long as the missiles were still flying, that architecture held. Then the ceasefire hit, and within hours the cameras moved in. What they found was not what the briefings prepared anyone to see. The districts of Tel Aviv that absorbed week after week of Iranian ballistic missile strikes, the areas where the government consistently used phrases like limited damage and localized impact, and do not look limited. They do not look localized. They look like a city that has genuinely been at war, not the clean, managed press release version of war, the real version. And now that the censorship has lifted, the real version is visible to anyone paying attention. Israel's military censorship system during active conflict is one of the most sophisticated information management architectures in the world. It is not propaganda in the crude sense of fabricating false information. It operates more subtly than that. It identifies categories of visual content, damage footage, casualty imagery, infrastructure failure documentation, and restricts their publication through a legal framework that gives the military censor authority to review and block material before it reaches the public. During the Iran-Israel conflict, that system was operating at full capacity. Journalists embedded in Tel Aviv knew what they could and couldn't show. International news agencies operating in the country worked under the same restrictions. The result was a stream of reporting that was technically accurate in what it included, but systematically incomplete in what it omitted. Buildings that took direct hits were described in text, but rarely shown in full. Neighborhoods with sustained damage were referenced but not documented visually in ways that conveyed the cumulative scale of what had happened. The phrase that appeared most consistently in official communications was limited and localized. Strike after strike, district after district, week after week, the language barely changed, limited and localized, ongoing assessment. The government remains committed to protecting its citizens. It became almost rhythmic, and because the visual documentation that would have contradicted that framing was legally restricted, the phrase had no immediate counter-evidence. What changed with the ceasefire is that the legal authority for that restriction expired. A cessation of hostilities triggers a different set of rules. The military censor's authority to block damage documentation during active conflict does not automatically extend into a post-conflict period, and the journalists who had been accumulating footage they couldn't publish were ready. Within hours of the ceasefire being confirmed, cameras were moving through districts that had been off-limits for weeks. The footage that began emerging almost immediately told a different story than the one the briefings had constructed. That gap, between the managed narrative and the visual reality, is the story that is now dominating every political conversation inside Israel. And it starts with understanding what Tel Aviv actually absorbed during the conflict, because the official account of the strike campaign was as carefully managed as everything else. To understand the scale of what the cameras are now documenting, you need a clear picture of the strike campaign itself. Not the version that appeared in press briefings, but the sequenced cumulative reality of what Iran directed at the city over the course of the conflict. The campaign that targeted Tel Aviv was not a single dramatic attack. It was a sustained, methodically paced series of strike packages that had a strategic logic running underneath the operational surface. Iran was not simply trying to cause damage with each individual strike. It was executing an attrition strategy designed to exhaust the interceptor stockpile of Israel's layered air defense system before launching the strike packages that were most likely to penetrate. This is the part that the public narrative consistently undersold. The early strikes in the campaign, the ones that were largely intercepted, the ones where the Iron Dome and David's sling systems performed visibly well, were not failures from Iran's perspective. They were investments. Every interceptor fired to destroy an incoming missile is an interceptor that is no longer available for the next wave. The attrition math is not complicated, but it was systematically absent from official briefings that emphasized successful interceptions without discussing what those interceptions cost in terms of stockpile depth. By the time the first uncontested ballistic missile strikes hit Tel Aviv, meaning strikes where the defense systems either could not engage or chose not to expend remaining interceptors on, the city had already absorbed the psychological weight of weeks of alert sirens, shelter rotations, and the disruption of normal life that sustained threat conditions produce even when physical damage is limited. That psychological foundation mattered when the uncontested strikes arrived, because the city's population had already been operating under sustained stress before the physical damage began escalating. 5 separate uncontested ballistic missile strikes reached Tel Aviv during the conflict. 5 events where Iranian missiles flew from launch points in Iran or from regional proxy positions and impacted inside the city's footprint without being destroyed in flight. Each of those events produced structural damage in the impact zone. Each produced casualties. Each produced a formal government statement using language calibrated to minimize apparent severity. And each was followed by the same cycle: shelter orders, damage assessment, official statement, limited visual documentation, repeat. The simultaneous dual-city attack, where Tel Aviv and Jerusalem were targeted in coordinated strike packages designed to split the air defense response, represented a qualitative escalation in the campaign. A defense system covering two cities simultaneously under coordinated attack faces a fundamentally different resource allocation problem than one covering a single target. The attack on Jerusalem in particular carried a dimension beyond the purely military, given the city's significance to multiple religious traditions and the political weight that any damage to its historic areas carries globally. The fact that both cities absorbed impacts in that strike package was significant both militarily and symbolically. Then came the Hajj Qasem missile in the Dizengoff area, a strike that hit one of the most recognizable districts in central Tel Aviv, an area associated in the global imagination with the city's cosmopolitan, vibrant urban identity. The footage from that strike that eventually emerged was among the most widely circulated images of the conflict internationally, even though its domestic publication had been restricted. The gap between what Israeli residents were officially told about that strike and what international audiences saw in footage that had moved through foreign media before the domestic censor could contain it became one of the early pressure points in the credibility of the official narrative. And then there is the Shahab 3. This is the element of the conflict that remains most contested, most deliberately obscured, and most consequential if the worst-case interpretation of available evidence turns out to be accurate. The Shahab 3 is Iran's longest-range ballistic missile. It is nuclear-capable. It was part of the original weapons program that defined international concern about Iran's strategic ambitions for decades. When a Shahab 3 impacted inside Tel Aviv, the government's statement about the event was notably brief. Warhead contents were not confirmed. The standard framework of limited and localized applied. Questions about the nature of the warhead were neither answered nor fully dismissed. That ambiguity was not an accident. Confirming a non-conventional warhead would trigger obligations, international, legal, and political, that the government was not prepared to navigate in the middle of an active conflict. Denying it definitively would require sharing evidence that the government may not have wanted in the public domain. Saying nothing meaningful was the option that preserved the most operational flexibility. It also left a question hanging over Tel Aviv's post-ceasefire recovery that nobody in an official position has yet moved to close. Walk through the Bnei Brak district of Greater Tel Aviv today, and what you see is not a district that has been destroyed. It is something more complicated and in some ways more unsettling than outright destruction, because it is the accumulated evidence of sustained damage across time rather than a single catastrophic event. Bnei Brak sits northeast of central Tel Aviv. Its proximity to infrastructure corridor targets, the kind of targets that appeared repeatedly in Iranian strike packages across the conflict, made it a recurring impact area not because its residential streets were primary aim points, but because blast radius effects and interceptor fragmentation patterns don't confine themselves to military geometry. When a missile is destroyed above a residential district, the debris falls into the residential district. When a strike intended for an infrastructure target hits slightly off aim point, the blast effects reach into whatever is nearby. Bnei Brak experienced this repeatedly. The visual evidence on the main commercial streets is not dramatic, it is granular and cumulative. Building facades show damage patterns consistent with multiple separate events. Not one strike, but 3, 4, 5 instances of overpressure or fragmentation, reaching the same buildings at different points across a multi-week campaign. Windows replaced with plywood and blocks where the glazing was destroyed by pressure waves and was never restored because the next wave arrived before restoration could be completed. Structural damage to the older building stock, Bnei Brak, has a significant proportion of older residential construction that is more vulnerable to blast effects than modern buildings, that has produced safety closures forcing residents into temporary accommodation. The commercial picture is the part that says the most about what sustained conflict does to urban economic life. The markets and shops and small businesses that gave Bnei Brak its economic texture before February 28th are operating at a fraction of their previous activity, not because they were all physically destroyed. Some are closed because the owners evacuated and haven't returned. Some are closed because the customer base evacuated and hasn't returned. Some are closed because staff members can't move through the debris and road disruption that weeks of nearby strike activity produced. The physical infrastructure of commerce is partially present, but the human infrastructure, the owners, the workers, the customers, has been scattered, and scattered populations don't reassemble the moment a ceasefire is announced. Move south toward the Neve Shannon neighborhood, and the picture shifts slightly but doesn't improve. This is an area with high population density and older housing stock, a district that was already carrying infrastructure pressure before the conflict began. The strikes that impacted in and around this area during the campaign landed on buildings that had less structural margin to absorb blast effects. The damage documentation that is emerging from this neighborhood is among the most visually stark of what is coming out of Tel Aviv in the ceasefire's opening hours. The residential blocks that sustain direct or near-direct impacts show the kind of structural damage that is not repaired in weeks. These are buildings where external walls have been compromised, where internal structural members have been exposed by blast effects, where the safety assessment process that normally follows a structural impact event hasn't had time to complete, because the city's technical and emergency services have been managing new impacts faster than they can process old ones. The queue of buildings awaiting full damage assessment in Tel Aviv right now represents weeks of backlogged inspections, and until that assessment is complete, residents displaced from those buildings cannot return even if every other condition for return were satisfied. What the streets of Tel Aviv are collectively showing is a city that has been worn down rather than knocked out. The kind of damage that doesn't produce the singular dramatic images that define public understanding of war zones, but that represents an enormous and sustained burden on the city's ability to function. It is the kind of damage that takes not weeks but months to fully document, assess, and begin repairing. And it was the kind of damage that the phrase limited and localized was specifically designed to prevent people from visualizing. If the neighborhood-level damage is the visible face of what the ceasefire has revealed, the infrastructure damage is the foundation underneath it. Less photogenic, less immediately dramatic, and far more consequential for how long it actually takes Tel Aviv to recover. The sequence of infrastructure impacts across the conflict was not random. Iran's strike planning systematically targeted the physical systems that urban life depends on: power generation and distribution, water treatment and pumping infrastructure, communications backbone elements, transportation nodes. Not all of those strikes were fully successful. Many were intercepted, degraded, or only partially effective, but across a multi-week campaign, even partial effectiveness accumulates into significant system degradation. The nationwide blackout that struck Israel during the conflict was among the most dramatic single infrastructure events of the war. Every city simultaneously losing grid power is not a routine event. It is the kind of disruption that triggers cascading failures across systems that depend on electricity, water pumping, sewage treatment, hospital operations, communications infrastructure, traffic management. Israel's grid was partially restored after the initial blackout, but partially restored is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The restoration was not complete before the grid was struck again. The second strike hit infrastructure that was already operating in a degraded and partially repaired state, which meant the second disruption started from a worse baseline than the first. What's visible in Tel Aviv now as a result of that sequence are the improvised solutions that a city under sustained attack develops to keep essential functions operating. Buildings running on emergency generators because their grid connection has not been fully restored. Power lines with visible repair work that was done quickly rather than to permanent standard. The patched, jury-rigged quality of infrastructure repair conducted under active threat conditions rather than in the controlled environment of a routine maintenance operation. Substations with temporary bypass configurations that are functional, but operating with less redundancy and less capacity than the pre-conflict infrastructure design assumed. The water picture is in some ways more immediately consequential for daily life than the power picture. Water infrastructure combines the vulnerability of physical pipeline assets, which can be directly damaged by strike effects, with the dependency on electrical power for the pumping systems that move water through those pipelines. When both the physical infrastructure and the power systems that serve it are degraded simultaneously, the result is not a simple restoration problem. It is a compound problem where fixing one element doesn't restore function unless the other element is also fixed. Across multiple districts of Tel Aviv, water distribution has been operating on emergency configurations throughout the latter weeks of the conflict. Tanker deliveries to distribution points in areas where household supply has been disrupted. Reduced pressure in districts where pumping capacity is below normal operating levels. The kind of infrastructure degradation that doesn't make front-page headlines, but that defines the texture of daily life for every resident trying to maintain basic household function in a city that has been under sustained attack. The communications infrastructure degradation is perhaps the least visible but most broadly consequential piece of the picture. Mobile network capacity across parts of Tel Aviv has been running below normal operating levels because cell tower infrastructure in affected areas was damaged and has not been fully repaired. The internet backbone connections that serve commercial and residential users in strike-affected districts have been running through emergency routing configurations with reduced capacity and reliability. These are not the kind of failures that produce dramatic visual documentation. They produce dropped calls, slow connections, and degraded service quality, the invisible friction of a communications infrastructure operating at reduced capacity. All of this infrastructure damage exists in Tel Aviv's current reality simultaneously. It represents not days of repair work, but months of systematic remediation across multiple technical domains. And it was occurring throughout the conflict, while the official narrative was focused almost exclusively on the kinetic elements of the story, the intercepts, the strikes, the military exchanges. with the unglamorous infrastructure dimension consistently underweighted in the public account of what the city was actually absorbing. The infrastructure story is important. The neighborhood damage story is important. But the human story, who left Tel Aviv during the conflict, how many people left, where they went, and what it will take to bring them back, is the dimension of the ceasefire's revelations that carries the most immediate political weight. Population displacement from a conflict-affected city is normally one of the most carefully tracked metrics of a humanitarian response. International organizations count displaced people. Governments report displacement figures. The scale of civilian disruption is normally part of the public accounting of what a conflict costs. None of that happened with Tel Aviv during this conflict. The same military censorship architecture that restricted damage footage also functioned to restrict the publication of information that could indicate the scale of civilian disruption beyond what the official narrative was prepared to acknowledge. Phrases like voluntary precautionary relocation appeared in some official communications. The implication was managed, orderly, temporary movement of some residents from directly affected areas, a measured and controlled response to a manageable situation. What the ceasefire's opening hours are beginning to reveal is that the scale of departure from Tel Aviv during the conflict was substantially larger than that framing suggested. The evidence is not yet fully quantified. The counting has barely started, but it is visible in the city's current state in ways that don't require a government report to understand. The foot traffic in districts that normally have dense pedestrian activity is measurably lower than pre-conflict baseline levels. Apartment buildings in strike-affected neighborhoods show vacancy rates that go beyond the normal churn of urban rental markets. The for rent signs and darkened windows at hours when lights should be on are present in concentrations that indicate departure rather than normal vacancy. The public transport utilization that is one of the most sensitive real-time indicators of urban population density is running below normal levels on routes through the most affected districts. The residents who left Tel Aviv during the conflict made rational decisions. They weighed the risk of staying in a city under sustained ballistic missile attack against the cost and disruption of leaving. Many moved to family members in other Israeli cities. Many traveled abroad to relatives or simply to countries not involved in the conflict. Some moved to areas of Israel that were less intensively targeted. All of them disrupted their lives, their employment, their children's schooling, and their social networks to make that move. And none of them are automatically going to reverse that disruption the moment a ceasefire is announced. The psychology of return from conflict displacement is not a simple switch. The people who left Tel Aviv did not leave in a state of calm assessment. They left under stress, under threat, often after a direct or near-direct strike impact in their neighborhood. The mental association between being in Tel Aviv and being in danger was built through weeks of lived experience. Alert sirens, shelter runs, the sound of impacts, the knowledge that the next wave might be worse than the last. A ceasefire agreement does not erase that association. It begins a process through which the association can eventually be unlearned, but that process takes months, not hours. The return of displaced residents to Tel Aviv depends on three things moving forward simultaneously: the ceasefire holding long enough to demonstrate credibility, the infrastructure being restored to a level where normal life is materially possible, and the psychological transition from conflict mode to post-conflict mode proceeding far enough that the instinct to leave before the next strike is replaced by the conviction that there will not be a next strike. None of those three conditions is fully satisfied in the ceasefire's opening hours. The first is uncertain. The second is weeks or months away in the most affected districts. The third depends on the first two. What this means practically is that Tel Aviv is not going to snap back to its pre-conflict state quickly. The city that emerges from this conflict will do so gradually, unevenly, with some districts recovering faster than others and some residents returning sooner than others. The population that was displaced is one of the most significant long-term recovery variables, not just because their absence affects the social fabric of the city, but because their absence affects the economic viability of the businesses and services that depend on their presence. A city cannot fully recover if a significant portion of its population is in a holding pattern waiting to see if the situation is safe enough to return to. The word ceasefire is doing a lot of heavy lifting in the current moment, and it is worth being precise about what this agreement actually represents, because the gap between what the word implies and what the document contains has direct consequences for Tel Aviv's recovery prospects. This is not a peace agreement. It is not a resolution of the underlying conflict between Iran and Israel or between Iran and the United States. It is a cessation of hostilities, a mutual decision by both sides to stop shooting at each other at this particular moment in time, based on calculations about cost and benefit that both sides made independently and arrived at roughly the same conclusion on roughly the same timeline. For the United States and Israel, the calculation involved multiple converging pressures. Military degradation of certain air defense and offensive capabilities was real and needed time to be addressed. Economic strain from a conflict that was driving oil prices upward and creating uncertainty across global markets was generating domestic political pressure that was difficult to manage indefinitely. The rising visibility of civilian damage, even through the filtered lens of the censorship architecture, was creating political friction with allies whose support was important for sustaining the international coalition framing of the conflict. And the specific military objectives that had been articulated as justifications for the conflict, regime change in Iran, elimination of Iran's missile program, dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, were clearly not achievable within the current operational framework. For Iran, the calculation was different in its specifics, but similar in its structure. The strikes that had reached Iranian infrastructure across more than 130 cities had produced real damage to civilian and military systems. The economic pressure of expanded sanctions was compounding the impact of physical infrastructure damage in ways that were beginning to affect Iran's capacity to sustain offensive operations at the tempo that had characterized the conflict's peak intensity. And critically, and from Iran's strategic perspective, the key objectives of the campaign had already been demonstrated: the ability to strike Tel Aviv repeatedly, the ability to penetrate Israeli air defenses after an attrition strategy drained the interceptor stockpile, the ability to demonstrate reach against U.S. infrastructure in the region, the ability to apply pressure on global trade routes through operations near the Strait of Hormuz. These were the demonstrations that constituted Iran's strategic rationale for the conflict, and they had been made. In that context, accepting a ceasefire was not a defeat for Iran's strategic logic. It was a consolidation. Continue fighting and risk further infrastructure damage, further economic degradation, and potentially a U.S. escalatory response that could reach a level Iran was not prepared to absorb. Accept a ceasefire and lock in the demonstrated capabilities while preserving the forces needed to use them again if strategic circumstances required it. Neither side achieved its maximalist objectives. The United States and Israel did not change the Iranian government, eliminate Iran's missile program, or destroy its nuclear infrastructure. Iran did not collapse the Israeli government, permanently close the Strait of Hormuz, or force a full U.S. military withdrawal from the region. Both sides can point to partial achievements: demonstrated capabilities, degraded adversary systems, political signaling accomplished, but neither can claim the conflict produced the outcome they publicly articulated as justification when it began. What that means for Tel Aviv is that the city is recovering not in the aftermath of a resolved conflict, but in the pause between rounds of a conflict whose underlying drivers remain in place. Iran's ballistic missile program still exists. The infrastructure used to plan, coordinate, and execute the strikes against Tel Aviv has not been eliminated. The strategic logic that made Tel Aviv a target in this conflict would still make Tel Aviv a target if hostilities resumed. And the air defense system that failed to stop 5 ballistic missile strikes from reaching the city during this conflict is not, in the ceasefire's opening hours, meaningfully more capable than it was when those strikes hit. The political consequences of what the cameras are now showing in Tel Aviv are not going to be contained by messaging. This is the reality that the government that managed the conflict is now confronting, and it represents perhaps the most consequential dimension of what the ceasefire has revealed. Israeli governments have managed the information environment around conflicts before. The censorship architecture that operated during this conflict is not a new invention. It has deep roots in the country's approach to managing public information during active hostilities. What is different about this moment is the scale of the gap between the managed narrative and the visible reality. The phrase limited and localized was applied to a campaign that included 5 uncontested ballistic missile strikes, a dual-city coordinated attack, a Shahab-3 with undisclosed warhead contents, and weeks of sustained drone and cruise missile operations. The cumulative physical and human impact of that campaign is now being documented in real time by cameras that no longer have a legal reason to avoid showing it. The citizens of Israel who lived through this conflict, who followed the instructions, took shelter when the sirens sounded, trusted the system, and listened to the official assessments, are now processing 2 things simultaneously. They are processing their own lived experience of what the conflict felt like from inside it, and they are processing the visual evidence of what it actually did to the city they live in. For many of them, those 2 things are aligning in a way that confirms the gap between what they felt was happening and what they were officially told was happening.